Highbridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Problem of Democracy, America, the Middle East, and the Rise and Fall of an Idea, by Shadi Hamid, read by Amin al-Gamal. Introduction. During the Arab Spring, when I was living in the Middle East, I would come back to the United States and share my impressions with American audiences. The Middle East was confusing, even to those who lived there. I wanted to draw a contrast, because the contrast, at least then, seemed quite real. Living there, I was struck by something that felt, quite literally, foreign. Perhaps that made sense. I was ultimately an outsider, as my Egyptian relatives often reminded me. I was born and raised in Pennsylvania, not Egypt. Egypt was the country of my parents, but wasn't my country. And if it wasn't my country, I wouldn't have to live with the consequences of my own ideas about democracy. They would, and they wanted nothing to do with it. A new democratic politics had emerged in a number of Arab countries, but the division seemed raw and existential, in a way that intrigued as well as frightened me. A lot was at stake, and in retrospect we now know that too much was at stake. This had not been my experience with American politics, which was reassuring in its smallness. Americans had their differences, to be sure, but they appeared to agree on the fundamentals. There was both a founding moment and myth. There was a constitution, not quite sacred, but close to it. Drawing on that shared history, we could pay tribute to a set of distinctly American ideals and ideas, even as we disagreed on their precise application. Because the country's foundations weren't in question, citizens were freed to debate policy, whether taxes, healthcare, or the deficit. It was possible to care deeply about things that weren't existential, and most things weren't. Those times seem quaint, and it's remarkable just how quickly my country changed. I was reminded of this speed while recently rereading a 2006 essay titled Limits to Democracy, written by the late British philosopher Roger Scruton. The year 2006 was a different era. George W. Bush had propelled the question of democracy to the center of public debate. But it wasn't our democracy, but theirs that we were debating. The blunders of Iraq were catching up with us, and the Bush administration insisted on covering or justifying those failures with the grandiose language of democracy. The rudimentary coverage of Islam aside, Scruton's essay is useful in how it highlights the foundational challenge of democratic politics, how or whether to respect election outcomes that appear threatening to either us, ourselves, our families, or our nations. He contrasts America and the West with those pesky Muslim-majority countries that can never quite seem to get their act together. I did chuckle, in that gallows humor sort of way, when he says the following: "The American norm is wholly unlike that of the Islamic countries. People vote Democrat and find themselves ruled by Republicans, and they accept this, unhappy perhaps, but acknowledging a duty of obedience and a common loyalty that is far more important than any electoral differences of opinion." For Scruton, this ability or willingness to be unhappy but still obliging when one's adversary wins an election is the precondition of democracy as we know it. In this sense, the other party is still merely an opponent, not an enemy. According to this metric, today, the United States no longer meets this prerequisite of democracy. The best glean on this is that, for now, a country such as ours can probably muddle through without this precondition being met. Probably. The United States has certain advantages when it comes to containing the mutual antagonism of its two parties. Strong institutions, democratic norms, and a long history of democratic practice. Long-standing, consolidated democracies rarely, if ever, break down. Decades or even just years ago, most observers would have said that the United States also enjoys the benefits of a democratic culture. In other words, Americans believe or believed in small d democracy. Culture can be overwhelming in its power, both mystical and mystifying, its judgments so familiar that it exists like a voice in your head, and yet it is impossible to explain exactly how this happens. Despite their power, however, cultures can change as well as crumble. At the time of this book's writing, a growing number of Americans do not seem willing to respect democratic outcomes that go against their wishes. While this tendency is most pronounced among Republicans, it goes further and deeper. We can all feel it, that existential tenor of politics that fills us with both dread and foreboding, telling us that something isn't quite right. Perhaps it is possible that we misunderstood what a democratic culture actually is in the first place. If a country can have a democratic culture in 2006 but then not have one in 2022, is it really a culture? Culture is sticky. It shouldn't be this easy to change in a mere matter of years. I don't believe that democracy is an aberration in human history, with an arc bending back toward authoritarianism. But I do believe we are moving toward a shared realization that existential politics is no longer, if it ever was, a Middle Eastern problem. It is a democratic problem. It is the problem of democracy. This existential tenor is very much alive in countries as diverse as Poland, Hungary, Brazil, India, the Philippines, to cite only a few. And of course, it has even spread to the world's oldest democracy, right here at home. For those of us who care about the democratic, this is likely to be the fundamental question of politics for some time to come, and maybe even the rest of our lives. How do we, as well as our opponents, respect democratic outcomes when the results threaten what we hold most dear? There isn't an answer. Not an obvious one, at least. Not all problems have solutions, and to think that they might itself be the bigger problem. There is a certain kind of wisdom in the imperfection of otherwise great ideas, and democracy may be one of them. 1. Is democracy worth supporting? Can the overthrow of a democratically elected leader ever be justified? The case of Chile in 1973, after the socialist Salvador Allende came to power, is perhaps the prototypical example of a persistent American dilemma. As Henry Kissinger, perhaps the most influential and controversial foreign policy thinker of the 20th century, memorably put it, I don't see why we have to stand by and watch a country go communist because of the irresponsibility of its own people. Kissinger could say this with a characteristic mix of coldness and sly wit. In his sentence, he also happened to capture, rather starkly, a tension that would undermine American foreign policy and often render it incoherent. If Allende had won, would it have been the end of the world, as one Latin America specialist in the State Department wondered? Probably not. But there would have been a cost. This book is about that cost. The cost of democracy producing bad outcomes, and whether it is a cost Americans should be willing to bear. More recently in the Middle East, the specter of anti-American Islamists coming to power in a democratic election only to cancel democracy, one person, one vote, one time, was a reminder that the tension was far from resolved. If democracy was about the right to make the wrong choice, why should America indulge in other people's wrong choices? Here, Kissinger once again saw things as he saw them in Chile. Referring to the rise of Islamist parties during the Arab Spring, Kissinger wrote that the advocacy of elections may result in only one democratic exercise of them. In other words, democracy might be nice, but it simply wasn't worth the trouble when its results were so uncertain and its participants so unreliable. Islamist parties believe that Islam and Islamic law should play a central role in public life, and organize politically around that goal. Naturally, then, they are likely to arouse suspicion. The fear of a democracy undone by Islamists has been as persistent as it is speculative. It is the fear of that which has not yet happened, which puts defenders of democracy in the uncomfortable position of either reassuring skeptics that Islamists will not win, or that they will win, but that they will be good, moderate, or otherwise acceptable. The more likely scenario is that they might win, but instead of ending democracy, they will do something rather more mundane. They will be bad, at least from the perspective of Western observers. Islamist parties will act against American interests, or American values, or both. One of the most persistent, vexing problems for America abroad, and particularly in the Middle East, is this democratic dilemma. We want democracy in theory, but not necessarily want its outcomes in practice. There are other, bigger problems, of course. Nuclear warfare, irreversible climate change, and the end of the human race come to mind. But they are not dilemmas in quite the same way. This democratic dilemma also happens to be a uniquely American one. Americans forget that very few countries insist on the promotion of democracy as a core component of their foreign policy, and fewer still have the power to do something about it. Because power and morality are inextricably linked in the American self-conception, the gap between interests and ideals is a question of identity as well as security. And no longer is this purely or even primarily a foreign policy problem. At home, a growing number of Americans are realizing that respecting democratic outcomes, when the ideological stakes are so high, and when those outcomes appear personally threatening, is easier said than done. To look then at the democratic dilemma abroad is to consider a deeper set of questions around why we believe democracy is good, as well as whether we think it is good for other nations and cultures. To put the question more starkly, is democracy worth it when it increasingly produces what seem to be destructive outcomes that put lives and livelihoods at risk? Why should mere democratic outcomes in elections take precedence over the other things we hold dear, such as liberalism, human rights, social justice, or racial equality? This book proposes an ambitious and controversial reimagining of the ongoing debate and argues for democratic minimalism as a path to resolving America's democratic dilemma. In the seemingly eternal tension between democracy and liberalism, recognized by the ancient Greeks, the founders, and chroniclers like Alexis de Tocqueville alike, it may be time to prioritize one over the other, rather than acting as if the two are intertwined, when increasingly they are not. As a matter of policy, what if there was a way to focus on democracy promotion, in the literal and narrower sense, rather than the promotion of both democracy and liberalism? There is an argument to be made for liberalism promotion, but it is not the one I will make here. Instead, democratic minimalism would privilege democracy, with its emphasis on the preferences of majorities or pluralities, through regular elections and the rotation of power, over liberalism, which prioritizes individual freedoms, personal autonomy, and social progressivism. Deciding on such a course would alter America's basic foreign policy orientation, providing the beginnings of a grand strategy at a time when the United States seems unmoored and aimless abroad. It would transform bilateral relationships in the Middle East and our engagement with Muslim electorates more broadly. And it would help shift our own understanding of democracy at home, at a time when Americans are losing faith in American ideals. In addition, it would better preserve America's national interests, if not necessarily in the short term, then in the long run. Adopting a course as new and undoubtedly risky as this is no easy task. But there are compelling reasons, both moral and strategic, to attempt it. Over the course of this book, I will offer my own best attempt to persuade the listener of an admittedly unpopular position. Why would something as controversial as this be a good idea, and why now? For starters, it would revive democracy promotion after being declared dead. But it would do so while taking into account a changing national mood and the limits of American power. Today, there is little appetite for the cultural and social engineering that was implicit or explicit in the liberal expansionist heyday of the 1990s and 2000s. Moreover, it would allow the United States to move away from the Middle East blunders of the past several presidents, each of whom, while radically different in temperament, ended up falling back on authoritarian regimes to diminishing returns. To put it as simply as possible, support for Arab authoritarian regimes undermines our interests over time, while violating the values we still claim to uphold. Of course, interests and values are intertwined in complex ways, so willfully undermining our own values ends up weakening U.S. leverage and credibility and allows regimes to disregard American exhortations as mere rhetoric, to be disregarded with the wink of an eye. On a broader level, America's rising global preeminence from the early 20th century into the 21st coincided with its commitment, partial and inconsistent, as it no doubt was, to the spread of democracy abroad. That one country was democratic and claimed that it was better because it was democratic had an important demonstration effect. The more the United States eclipsed the Soviet Union, the more pro-democracy forces found themselves buoyed. The counterfactual is perhaps even more illustrative, and it is almost too self-evident to state. If the Soviet Union had somehow beaten the United States, although it's never been made exactly clear what this would mean, the so-called third wave of democratization across Eastern Europe would not have happened. The fact that American hypocrisy is so often brought up by critics of U.S. foreign policy, including myself, is a testament to the fact that critics believe that the United States was capable of being better and judged it accordingly. The charge of hypocrisy is only effective if the country in question is good at least some of the time. Calling out the Soviet Union for similar hypocrisies would have made little sense. No one, even or particularly its most fervent supporters, expected Soviet leaders to respect democracy. Instead, the goal was rather explicit: the establishment of the dictatorship of the proletariat. It is true that Stalin's atrocities turned some against the socialist project, but this had less to do with elections and popular representation, and more to do with the difficulty that even true believers had in stomaching mass killing on an epic scale. The author Robert Kagan characterizes this somewhat differently, emphasizing the legacy of enlightenment. After World War II, because of America's unrivaled power, he writes, those Enlightenment principles suddenly enjoyed a force behind them that they had never before possessed. Which Enlightenment principles might these have been? In Kagan's estimation, liberalism and democracy, as well as capitalism, went together. They did in fact go together, but that is different than saying that they must at all times. This might seem like an odd time to sing the praises of democracy, whether at home or abroad, particularly as fears over democracy's staying power continue to grow, including in my own country, the United States. As the Dutch historian David van Rybroek put it in his book, Against Elections, there is something strange going on with democracy. Everyone seems to want it, but no one believes in it any longer. Even if we did believe in it, haven't we already tried promoting it in the Middle East and failed spectacularly? President George W. Bush's freedom agenda is the most obvious example. The freedom agenda was certainly bold and drew considerably from a controversial intellectual premise. In many ways, it was a patriotic update of so-called Blame America First arguments associated with left-wing activists, which made it all the more ironic coming from Bush and the neoconservatives. Their argument was also intuitive. In the absence of democracy and basic political rights, citizens are more likely to resort to violence because they lack peaceful, constructive means to express their grievances. Accordingly, the attacks on September 11 did not happen because they hated our freedom, but rather because the Middle East's stifling political environment bred anger, frustration, and ultimately, violence. However, the Bush administration's commitment to the freedom agenda didn't last. After a brief period of apparent democratic opening in 2004 and 2005, American officials backtracked after Islamist parties made significant electoral gains in Egypt, Lebanon, and Bahrain. In the Palestinian territories, the election of the militant group Hamas in 2006 became the new cautionary tale, much as Chile was during the Cold War. While the Bush administration understood the importance of elections, perhaps to a fault, it incorrectly assumed they would produce moderate outcomes. It is now the stuff of legend that National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice's heart skipped a beat when she first heard the news of Hamas's victory while running on her treadmill at 5 in the morning. It is easy to poke fun at moments like this that grow in significance with the passing of time. We know Hamas won, but it could have been otherwise, couldn't it? There was a world in which the moderates of Fatah might have won instead, and those who believed in such a world would have been drawing on a considerable academic literature. The belief that participation and moderation went hand in hand also happened to be intuitive, even if it turned out to be wrong. As Bush's Deputy National Security Advisor Elliot Abrams put it to me, the assumption was that the average person is concerned about educating his or her children, making a living. In retrospect, he, like so many others, wondered how much good faith to extend to a fickle electorate. There's no question that some of the vote for Hamas was a protest vote against Fatah. But how much of it was that? And how much of it was the notion that Israel needs to be destroyed? And the only way to do that effectively is through violence. It's not zero. I mean, is it 5%? Is it 35%? Same thing in Egypt. When people vote for the Brotherhood, what are they voting for? And how many of them were actually truly Islamists? Maybe we were much too optimistic in thinking, they're voting for good government. They're voting to end corruption. Most Americans, however, were not paying attention to the complex voting patterns of Palestinians or Egyptians. What they would have been aware of was a narrative of military supremacy and liberal ambitions. With the Bush administration attempting to aggressively spread its values and try its hand at social engineering in the form of nation-building projects in Iraq and Afghanistan. Indeed, this has been the most persistent critique of America's post-Cold War foreign policy, that it has been led astray by an increasingly outdated version of liberal hegemony. Realist critics like John Mersheimer and Stephen Walt, as well as younger scholars on the left like Stephen Wertheim, argue that these more expansive conceptions of liberal foreign policy aim to increase the prevalence of liberal democracies. As this suggests, realists generally see liberal expansionism abroad as a natural extension of the universalist tendencies inherent in liberalism. If we accept the premise that liberalism is not neutral, then, like any ideological orientation, it will have trouble restricting its own application. It will want more for itself. On this, they have a point. The question is whether it is possible or desirable to limit the excesses of liberal hegemony while still retaining a pro-democracy posture abroad. If liberal dreams, a desire to remake the world in our image, have fueled American hubris, then these excesses can be mitigated by a conscious decision to put less emphasis on the liberal in the promotion of liberal democracy. What if instead we wished other countries to be mere democracies, emphasizing democracy as a system and means of governing and rotating power with no prejudice to substantive ideological outcomes? This would allow us to respect other countries' right to self-determination and self-government. It would limit our need to engage in social engineering in countries that American officials don't necessarily understand. It would also help resolve our democratic dilemma, particularly at a time when it seems that more and more electorates are deciding they would rather not be liberal. The two core components of liberal democracy, liberalism and democracy, are diverging. For most of the modern era, the two concepts had gone hand in hand, at least in the West. The classical liberal tradition, emerging out of the Enlightenment after Europe exhausted itself with wars of belief, prioritizes non-negotiable personal freedoms and individual autonomy, eloquently captured in documents like the Bill of Rights. Meanwhile, democracy, while requiring some minimal protection of rights to allow for fair and meaningful competition, is more concerned with popular sovereignty, popular will, and responsiveness to the voting public. In the suggestively titled The People versus Democracy, Yasha Monk discusses the disjuncture. On the one hand, the preferences of the people are increasingly illiberal. Voters are growing impatient with independent institutions and less willing to tolerate the rights of ethnic and religious minorities. On the other hand, elites are taking hold of the political system and making it increasingly unresponsive. The powerful are less and less willing to cede to the views of the people. That democracy and liberalism can diverge is not a novel observation. But it has become more obvious of late, not only in the might-be democracies of the Middle East, but also in actual democracies, old and new, such as Italy, France, Hungary, Poland, Israel, India, and Brazil. In each of these countries, illiberal right-wing parties have risen to power through democratic means. Their commitment to individual freedoms and minority rights has been questionable at best. At times they have been actively hostile to the liberal tradition. The ascendance and hegemony of liberal democracy during the Cold War, and its seeming triumph after communism's fall, made it easy to forget that the story of politics is a story of a struggle between liberal and democratic impulses, founded as they are on different conceptions of human needs and wants. Whether the United States should emphasize liberal values, such as the supremacy of the individual over the collective, gender equality, minority rights, and sexual freedom, or electoral democracy hinges on perceptions of what is, or should be, universal across time and place, and what is not. For the United States, such debates are inescapable. The country, after all, is founded on a set of universal premises about rights and the sovereignty of the individual, in theory if not necessarily in practice. If history has a progressive arc, in which good things go together and amplify each other, why shouldn't they go together in the Middle East? For its part, the realist tradition in international affairs tends to balk at overwrought talk of universal values. For the good liberal, individual rights and protections for minorities are sacrosanct, even if such protections run afoul of the majority of voters. And if liberalism matters within borders, it should also matter outside of them. Values are important in and of themselves, but they also help nations project soft power abroad. This soft power may be amorphous, but this doesn't make it any less real. For the good realist, anything that attracts the label soft carries less weight. In the place of values and arcs bending toward justice, a sense of the tragic is paramount. Because humans are fallible, neo-utopian notions of a more perfect world and a global system where norms are enforceable are inherently flawed. Instead, anarchy defines the international realm. Power is the only true currency. Values may matter, but they are secondary at best, or mere luxuries to be indulged in after the question of power is given due consideration. For the purposes of transparency, I have been an outspoken critic of realism in its various iterations. While I am sympathetic to maintaining a developed sense of the tragic, I do not believe that further de-emphasizing values in international affairs is the right response to a tragic world,
Sample complete. Ready to continue?